So again, thank you all for joining us for our weekly All Neighborhoods mutual aid calls. We have these calls every week, like Lucas said, Wednesdays at 6 p.m. This week, our topic is multilingual access and outreach. And I just want to note the comment that Caroline put in the chat here saying, please identify your neighborhood group and your group's biggest strength and biggest weak spot in terms of multilingual organizing. So we already have some folks commenting, like Michelle B here, talking about organizing with Mekong NYC. So please drop these comments in the section so that our speakers can see them in real time, or so that we can have a conversation about them during the Q&A. So that way in real time, we can take the things that you're seeing on the ground and we can adapt this call to the actual things you all want to discuss about. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce the first speaker that we have for tonight. And the way the format is going to be is that each speaker is going to have about 10 or so minutes, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, to talk about their work. And then we'll go straight into a Q&A following each speaker for 5 minutes if there's questions. So with that, I'm going to introduce my first speaker. We have Alba Mota from Language Co-op, which does language justice work across all 5 boroughs. And with that, Alba, please take it away.
Well, hi, can you hear me now? Perfect. Hi, good evening, everyone. I want to first thank so much to Anna for reaching out to me and inviting me to this platform and to this space. I really commend on the work that all of you are doing. It's such important work, especially you're in the crisis and knowing that our community needs more than ever that we come in solidarity and really help each other unconditionally. So thank you so much for organizing this and putting this together and inviting me and on behalf of Caracol. So I've been in Caracol, just a little bit of myself. I'm going to be brief. I've been in Caracol for about 6 years as a first as a collaborator and then as a work owner. Caracol is a cooperative of language justice. We are interpreters and translators, and our work is national and international. And one component of our language justice work is education, to educate the community, to educate other institutions and organizations on how to implement efficiently the language justice tool in their own settings, in their own organizations. So I love the language work. I started interpreting for my family and then for the community, and then I ended up in Caracol, and I really it's one of my passion, because it's a way to bridge culture, to bridge community, and to provide I don't like to say a voice because everybody had their own voices, but at least to put those voices that have been forgotten on the table. So I'm just gonna in the social language and the language justice context, I just wanna kind of says what is language justice, because we throw that word around, language justice, but what is it? And language justice is the right to everyone in a room or in a particular setting, the right for everyone to communicate in the language in which they feel more comfortable, being able to express themselves and their ideas and be understood, and be able to participate. So language justice also is serve as a way to break barriers within the social justice context. So for Caracol, us the interpreter, when we come to a place to provide language justice, we make sure that people are creating an experience that promote inclusiveness and belonging. Because that's the only way, I think, for a social justice movement to really be authentic, is when everybody is participating and is communicating in their own language. And since we are coming from the lens and the focus of the United States, we always have the dynamic of having English and Spanish at the language where we communicate from. But most often we make the assumption that people that come from in America, especially, which is the population that we interpret for, we make the assumptions that the first language is Spanish, and we don't pay attention that like in America has their own the people's nations have their own languages, and they have their own dialect, their own way of communicating that is not Spanish. In some cases, Spanish is even the third language that they learn to speak, and in some cases, they learn Spanish in the United States actually after they migrated from their country. So as an interpreter and as a language justice promoter, one of the things that we try to educate people around is like we are when we are interpreting, we have to make sure that we are not perpetuating the colonial systems of oppression when we are bringing Spanish also as also in the room as the language that we are targeting as an interpreter as interpretation for interpretation. So in the community that we have been able to educate and to work with, we try to kind of bring those nuances, and it's challenging because being myself a bilingual person, and when I came to Caracol and got educated about and learned from experience and through reading and through that, we tend to forget that the people's nations have their own languages and they need to be brought to light, be respected, and also be acknowledged in those spaces as well. As well as we are acknowledging that we are in our ancestral land, as well when we are acknowledging that we are in stolen land. It's the same thing, that we're using the same language and we're using the same kind of tool to perpetuate that. So when we break those barriers and we break with all of those kind of way of how we operate in the then it's then we are able to can operate from that mode of promoting language justice. So now, how can we implement, how can we have a successful language justice setting or space? There's a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. One thing is like that we have interpreters that have the experience of already being exposed to language justice concept, having also knowing what type of interpretation mode is going to be implemented, if it's simultaneous or consecutive. Another thing that also we need to keep in mind is also, if equipment is going to be used. If equipment is going to be used, is the equipment working? Also, a point person for the interpreter to talk to if there's any issues when we're trying to set a multilingual space, a language justice space. Also, another thing that we tend to forget is that interpreters themselves have working standards. Not many people know that in any given space or event or services that language needs to be provided, interpreters have their own workers standards. Like, we are not supposed to interpret more than a certain amount of time, or we're supposed to be have a partner. If we don't have a partner, another co-interpreter, then have a point person that can take cover interpretation when the interpreter has to have their needs met. So all of those things sometimes our community don't is not even aware, and so bringing this education to the rest of the community is really important. important for keeping the standards that we need to keep of high quality interpretation, of high quality language justice services. Um, Another thing also is if material is going to be given, is the material interpret in all the languages that is going to be provide that in all the languages in that particular event. If it's not, if the material is not translated into the languages that are going to be in that space, then somebody needs to read to the person the material into their languages. Another thing also is, having the guidelines as a way to for the community or agreements of interpretation be something that is your responsibility. As interpreter, when we come into the room, we try to be invisible because we are just there to kind of build a bridge of communication, but at the same time, not to kind of bring kind of not to bring the attention, but not just to serve as a bridge for the facilitate. That's the role that we take as interpreters. So another thing that I wanted to also mention is when we come to those spaces and we are bringing our dominance or the mainstream of way of doing things, we need to also take into consideration how as the dominant cultures, how we are impacting other cultures, how other cultures relate to to family values, how they relate. When we want to really be able, when we want to really provide quality communication or translation, or excuse me, interpretation, we had to take into account all those different intersectionality and layers of the culture, of how people relate to even food, like how they relate to rituals, to music. So all of that also come into intersectionality to language, because language is everything. When you communicate, you're communicating who you are, your essence. You're communicating. We do everything with language, right? We communicate our. That's how we communicate how we feel. That's how we communicate. That's how we are able to break with systems of oppression through having the power of the language. So when we give those tools to the people that are being oppressed, that's when we are definitely bringing language justice to the work that we're doing. And bringing caracol sometimes is you know as it comes from with frustration when you come to a space that you're seeing the power dynamic and the imbalance of how people are and sometimes it's unknowingly that they start speaking the dominant language and without even um, taking into consideration that interpretation is happening. So they start talking really fast, or it had happened also that if the person feels that the other person speaking the target language or the language that we're going to interpret to, they look at the person who speaks their language instead of like looking at all everybody as equal, but more like, oh, this is the person that understand me, so I'm gonna be putting my attention to this person. And those spaces again is work in progress, and it's been a challenge bringing this kind of mentality, like shifting the mentality um, of leveling the playing field when we are bringing um, language justice into the space, when we're bringing the tools of creating a context where everybody their voices are equal, where nobody is, there's no inequality in the way they're going to share their experiences, in the way they're going to share the voices and their opinion. So, from the Caracol perspective, we had developed curriculum for different audiences, that for different settings, and the community has the community has welcomed a lot of the tools that has been brought, and we definitely still had to grow more and develop more material because it's much needed. And so yeah, so I mean,
Alba, would this be a good time to transition to questions and answers? We have
yeah,
maybe a minute or two.
yes. Oh, sorry that I went over. I was looking at the clock. Yeah, definitely. Yes, yes.
All good. Yeah, no worries. That was a lot of rich information. So if folks have questions for Alba, please drop them in the chat so we can read them out loud and Alba can take them. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, but if you do have a question, for some reason, Zoom, our settings in the background don't allow individual private messages. So just put at Alba and I'll make sure that she sees them. I'll private message her if anyone has a question. If you have a question that comes up afterwards. But with that, Alba, I want to thank you and thank you to Caracol Language Co-op for all the amazing work that you're doing and for taking the time out of your busy day to share with us, the best practices that you all have. So thank you, and we're seeing a lot of gratitude in the chat. With that being said, we are going to transition to our next guest speaker, which is Alina Shen. Alina Shen is from CAV, Organizing Asian Communities, and Alina is going to talk a little bit about the language justice work as it relates to mutual aid organizing around housing justice during this COVID period. So Alina, please take it away. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Alba. My name is Alina, and I'm a public housing organizer from CAV, Organizing Asian Communities. So we organize in Chinatown Tenants Union in Manhattan's Chinatown and in Western Queens, where Chinese, Korean, and Bangladeshi tenants come together to form an Asian Tenants Union that is based in Queensbridge houses, the largest public housing development in the country. I have a public housing poster behind me. So I wanted to start by saying that so when we bring people into a movement, it often isn't as simple as recognizing material commonalities, like we're all in the same housing situation, especially in the work that I do. So as many people probably know on this call, language justice is a so-called hard skill that affects not only the event itself or the organizing project itself, but agendas, ground rules, how questions are phrased, and space is made to respond to them. And it takes constant and rigorous practice from not just facilitators, but also participants and community members. And so I say all that just to make the point that language justice as simply legislation or a volunteer program, while amazing, is not enough. So currently there's a statewide call to cancel rent from tenants in both rent stabilized public housing and many other groups, including the houseless. In public housing, there's already a rent hardship program which allows tenants to apply for a rent reduction. Unfortunately, all this means is that there's more bureaucratic hurdles from a faulty online portal than any real substantial service or change for tenants. And so I wanted to take a minute to say that anything that if anything, the rent hardship program kind of reveals that or demonstrates that means-tested models for providing services will never work. It just means another faulty online portal. It just means Tenants are being logged out. Tenants are hearing differing answers from the management office. And it means more time being hung up on for interpretation, or it means that management office staff are less likely to believe tenants when they cannot explain themselves in English. And it means also faulty Google Translate versions of online applications and less room for mistakes on either end, tenants or representatives. And so this is what other folks have called bureaucratic violence when service provision, I don't know if that's a real term, but I've heard people much smarter than me use it. And it's when, you know, all of these bureaucratic hurdles kind of wear away at people's ability to act and react. And so I wanted to kind of shine a light on the work that we've been doing. When we called our folks at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis and made our you know, check-in calls with them, we found what most of you probably already know. Unfortunately, no one was sitting at home waiting for the government to provide for them. They were already circulating resources for food or masks via WeChat, which is an online social media resource that originated in China and the Chinese diaspora uses, via WhatsApp, and we found that Bangladeshi tenants that we talked to use WhatsApp or text. And when we asked what they needed, they responded with two general buckets within the Asian Tenants Union. The first is they said their homes are still filthy and neglected with leaks, mold, and pared down repair staff. So again, the public health crisis did not start, nor will it end with COVID-19, especially in public housing. And our organizing is always linked to immediate survival. So tenants, so that's the first piece, right? Like our housing, especially affordable housing, is still underfunded and neglected. And the second piece, the second bucket that these responses often fell into is that tenants who were workers in the immigrant gig economy, so home care, taxi, restaurant, and construction workers, were struggling with the means-tested aid provision that would enable them to apply for unemployment or rent reductions. So they said, you know, we need cancel rent across the board. And you know, these are definitely professions that I'm sure people on this call have experience with or come into contact with. But for example, home care workers are a very popular industry for Chinese-speaking tenants because there often is no other employment available for immigrants that do not speak English. Yeah, I wanted to make this extremely brief. And so I just wanted to end on saying that I am a 1.5 generation Chinese American. My mom grew up in New York's Chinatown in public housing, and my dad grew up in Jamaica, Queens. And I grew up speaking Mandarin Chinese until ESL class in kindergarten. And so my relationship to language is complicated, like most people, and also deeply personal. Right, I feel like organizers that organize outside of maybe the language that they're used to are always thinking, should I be the one organizing? Most primarily, you know, non-English speaking folks. And I think for me, I just want to make the point that language justice is also a kind of like intergenerational reckoning and an ongoing process that feels deeply tied for me to working through family and working through a lot of the issues that feel extremely intimate, I would say. And so I just wanted to end on that point, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to reflect a little bit on how language justice affects the housing work that we do.
Thank you so much, Alina. And yeah, great to hear all the work that you're doing with and on behalf of CAV and you know, the folks that you're organizing for housing justice. So we have a question that I accidentally skipped from the last round, and I'm going to pass it to Lucas, who's been tracking it. Lucas, go ahead, unmute yourself and share that question away.
Sure. Sorry, it was also just in kind of response to different groups outlining what the work that they've been doing around language and some of the challenges that they've had, particularly around their volunteer base. So I just put in a question, any tips from either of the speakers about how to engage if you have kind of a limited speaking ability yourself. I mean, a lot of times it's people who are delivering groceries or engaging with neighbors in other ways, and you might not actually be at the skill level of a professional interpreter. Obviously, most of us aren't. So are there any tips about how to do that work effectively if there might not be resource people around, but to kind of bridge some of that divide between language when you're confronted with somebody that kind of there's an exchange between a mutual aid group and a neighbor who's kind of reached out in some way?
I could help answer that. One thing that you could if you're limited in the language that you're speaking to, you know, try to be as authentic as you can, or like also there's some YouTube video that from Highlander that give you tips of when you are doing interpretation. Um, um, if if you're like talking one-on-one with a person, try to, if the cases that you are trying to if you understand more than the speaking part, just try to go slowly and don't, like, oh, and the person sometimes could help you too. You could ask them like, I don't know how to say this word, and sometimes they know how to say it in English. Um, Also, try to have like a glossary of words that are like related to food, to greetings. Like if you have it written down and carry that with you, that maybe on the spot you could like look at it like very quickly. That's another option. Also, if you're in the middle of something, I mean, I don't recommend it as much, but in case, just go to Google, put translation, you know, say whatever you want to say, and then Google. I mean, it's not the best option, but if worst come to worst that you need to say something, um, just Google translation, and then it will give you. Google is not 100% accurate. It has a lot of mistakes, a lot of errors. I don't recommend it at all. But if it's something like an emergency that is like something quick that you need to like, but my recommendation will have to have a glossary of related words that you want to communicate, and just have it at hand, have it with you. Yeah, that's what I would recommend. And try to, whenever you have time, there's on YouTube, like I say, Highlander institution has very good YouTube videos that you could watch on how to interpret, and like how to get out of a situation when you don't have all of the sentences together. They give you a lot of tips on that. And I could put the information Highlander on the chat. I could share that now.
Great. Thank you, Alba. Thank you so much. Yeah, please share that link when you get a chance. So we're just at time. And Alina, I do want to give you the opportunity to pick one of these two questions before we move on to our next speaker. And the first question is from Michelle. As a second-generation Southeast Asian organizer, I just wanted to ask, how do you and others at CAV improve your language capacity as you're doing one-on-one work with your community members? And the second question is, do you have thoughts on how to address the intimacy of the work of language justice?
There's a clearly easier question here. I'll address the first one and then try and maybe parse out an answer in the chat for the second. We practice. We're lucky enough that we know on staff, and also have volunteers that we can practice with. And so what we'll do is after a while we kind of get a gist of what are some of the troubleshooting areas. Like what if someone asked about more surveillance or more cops in the community, and then we'll kind of like workshop with another organizer or volunteer in language, and figure out what are some good things to say that are really quick and succinct, and then we'll kind of like notate that down. And yeah, I think we try to do it every like quarter or like twice a year or something like that. But recently, I think I've had to do it like by myself. Like I'll just chart out on a piece of paper what I need to phrases I need to look up, or like what I need to practice saying. And I think it's like muscle memory, like yeah. But I'm also happy to chat more, because this is something that we're also working through, especially around like PE, because even it like directly translated phrases kind of get lost and flattened. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alina, and all the amazing and incredible work you're doing with and behalf of CAV. So yeah, just want to thank and acknowledge you. So with that, we will now introduce our third guest speaker. And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Amna Khan from Desi's Rising Up and Moving, aka Drum, and also from Kensington Mutual Aid. Take it away, Amna.
Thank you, and it is Amna, perfectly said. Before I begin, I just wanted to thank Caroline for inviting me, and I also wanted to just give a brief history of Drum. So Drum stands for Desi's Rising Up and Moving. It's an organization of working class Desi, which is South Asian or Indo-Caribbean members in New York City. We work on issues that impact our community, so that's immigration, racial justice, workers' rights, gender justice. It was founded in 2000, coming from the police accountability movement in New York City in the late 90s. And we started off by doing immigration-related services, so like helping people in detention centers, but we quickly realized it wasn't getting at the root causes of the issues in our community. And so Drum was on the ground during 9/11, and the National Security Entry Exit Registration System, or NSEERS, are predominantly Muslims, which led to many folks who were undocumented, even if they had no criminal record, being deported. Loved ones didn't know where their family members were as they went missing. In Little Pakistan in Kensington, Brooklyn, for example, the other border of the neighborhood I'm from became a ghost town. And so at a time of extremist Islamophobia, people hearing horror stories of people being tortured, it even led to a lot of people, including current Drum's family members, choosing to self-deport. And we lost a lot of our membership, and we don't have as many of the same members as we did in the early 2000s. And that was the formative years of doing this work. And so at Drum, a good chunk of our membership is also undocumented. And I just want to point out, immigrant workers and undocumented workers are essential workers, period. Not just during this pandemic, but for someone who lives paycheck to paycheck, who doesn't have money next week, is not working an option for them? No, these folks will get sick, the virus will spread it. And if the most vulnerable are not safe, then no one is. And we as a society are not doing anything at all to support these excluded workers. And so many of the drivers, delivery workers, farm workers, restaurant workers, the ones keeping us fed and supplied, are also the ones barred from the supports that are being created: stimulus check, unemployment benefits, and so on. And so at an organizing level, we must think about all of these things that we've been fighting for so long, like universal health care, better wages, benefits for all workers, more funding for hospitals, social services, less policing or jails. And so if we were able to get all of these things, what would our reality right now be? Would we be in a terrible situation like we are today? Though we are acting out of crisis, that doesn't mean that it's the only way to be. For everyone saying that we can't go back to the way things are in the pandemic, that would mean that we were doing something differently than we've done in the past. Because if we're doing the same thing and that we've done if we do things the same way we've done in the pandemic and expect a different outcome, does that make sense? No. And so the question becomes, even during a pandemic, how do you continue to build power and people together? And so at Drum, we have a membership of 4,500. Currently, members are working class. Why? Because Drum believes in this concept of mass protagonism, of building local leadership and giving otherwise fractured communities a unified voice, and of providing investment and ownership, providing structure and social justice transformation so that people aren't seen as objects but subjects. Essentially, we're not waiting around for a community leader or a famous activist or someone else to save us. How do we get the ones affected by it to take up the fight? And so as we're realizing, our safety and security is tied to each other. Our government at the federal level and local level is not doing enough. And in this moment, while we socially quarantine ourselves, we can't be in isolation. We need to build communities, solidarity amongst each other, and that's the approach we're taking. And this is where solidarity comes in. We have members from different countries, different religions. And for example, our Queen's meeting can be conducted in up to 5 languages simultaneously. English, Bangla, or actually more than that. English, Bangla, Hindi, Urdu, Nepali, Farsi, Pashto, Punjabi, to name a few. And so the majority of our membership is not English speaking, and our work needs to be accessible in other languages, not to mention the dialects that exist in our communities. As an organization, we're multilingual. Because so much of our work relies on interpretation, people might be scared if someone is externally coming in from another organization. There are security concerns, sensitive information that might be shared, and that's why we need to train internally and develop to do that in translation. We also recognize that language needs to change from base to base. Members are the ones who do that work and who have done interpretations for not just Drum, but other organizations. So whatever materials, any literature such as that related to rent strike, we try to make accessible in other languages. And I just want to emphasize again how important language is to mutual aid. Language determines who can or cannot access mutual aid. And I don't just mean verbally. When you create a process, that process itself could be what excludes people. It could be the barrier. And so when you have a Google form, when you have the tech skills to navigate it, it becomes restricted. And when we engage with people for tasks like the census, we realize it's not just about the census. Through the process of talking about census or mutual aid, how do we get folks to engage? How do we expand our reach and community, increase our capacity of Drum members to reach out to all of their contacts, to make sure that their people are well aware of the health safety practices and that they're connected with resources available? And Drum helped me to develop those skills to exercise that leadership within community. Is because of their institutional memory that I was reached out to by Keto from Mutual Aid NYC to then facilitate the first meetings for Kensington Windsor Terrace Mutual Aid. Instead of the Drum advisors joining the meetings to do all the work, they encouraged and supported me. And the Kensington Facebook Mutual Aid was first created by Jara Kirby before the stay-at-home orders, and Jara took inspiration from the Occupy Sandy movement. Originally, we only focused on Kensington. Kensington has limited access to Wi-Fi, a low average medium household income, is among the most playground deprived, and has a high intake of domestic violence cases. And so to address these inequities, we quickly realized it made sense to combine our efforts with more affluent neighborhoods like Windsor Terrace and bridge the council district borders of Kensington, thus becoming the Kensington Windsor Terrace Mutual Aid Group, to share and distribute the abundant resources present. It's no coincidence that our zip code is a hot spot, or our neighboring Muslim funeral services homes handle about 15 deaths per day. Many of our requests are coming from folks who are undocumented, folks who are excluded from unemployment insurance or federal cash assistance. And it doesn't look like banging pots and pans are clapping at 7 p.m. because many essential workers such as taxi cabs drivers live in Kensington are disproportionately being tested positive for COVID or are dying. And I actually be curious to see a breakdown of that demographic, the neighborhoods that participate. But though Kensington looks a bit like a ghost town right now, the work of our partner organizations and mutual aid volunteers has lifted our spirits. And our mutual aid group has this motto: if you need help, ask. If you have something to give, give. Volunteers with the capacity to give are matched to vulnerable populations in need, but this doesn't mean the two are mutually exclusive. Volunteers with fulfilled requests have also made some of their own. We also serve as a liaison to existing community-based infrastructure. As Miriam Kaba notes, mutual aid is solidarity, not charity. And so though there are a lot of well-intentioned folks, there needs to be engagement with immigrants and communities of color. Due to issues of digital literacy, language barrier, or not wanting to share intimate needs online, we mapped out our area of Kensington Windsor Terrace and divided it into zones to first identify the needs and then create a resource bank. And after building a phone tree and checking in with our contact list, we designed a comprehensive flyer in over 12 languages and did outreach all around the area and in institutions such as schools or religious centers. And to avoid reinventing the wheel, we identified and built relationships with partner organizations, including some contacts through Drum, and sent requests from their baseline pantry essentials, which are also, I must mention, culturally sensitive and cater to different communities of color, where appropriate upon assessment. And we have a separate dispatch team for this, or supplement with the itemized list that cannot be otherwise be fulfilled. And so we're fortunate enough to exhaust our resources and then focus on fundraising and provide cash grants. But as I mentioned earlier with digital literacy, we recognize not everyone has access to broadband internet, let alone a smartphone, and provided alternatives to Venmo and PayPal. And so besides supporting our neighbors and organizing to build people power, our group is simply, our goal for this group is simply to exist post-pandemic. And that doesn't have to look like our current iteration, as that can and will evolve, but the neighborhood network we once relied on should continue existing. And so finally, we understand that our emergency funds or supplies are not going to last forever. For these reasons, we are thinking about organizing rent strikes, signing petitions calling for rent and mortgage freeze, housing the homeless, or advocating for a bill to get cash assistance for those excluded from existing efforts.
Wow, Amna, thank you so much. It's incredible to hear about the work you and your colleagues and comrades at Drum are doing. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And now we will like to open it up to questions for Amna and even for any of the other guest speakers, since this is the final portion of the webinar for the training, at least. And so please drop the questions in the chat and I will read them as they come. There's actually one question from the previous round that I missed, and it is from AJ, who's asking, and again, any one of you three can take it. Amna, or any of the other folks. So here's a question that AJ had. Alba, thinking a lot about how we speak to each other, even when we share a language during the pandemic, and that in this mutual aid work, convos are often limited to how to fill an immediate emergency need. Thoughts about how we can build stronger connections of solidarity and away from charity approach. And you know, I think you were starting to allude to a lot of this actually about the work you're all are going to continue beyond the pandemic. So again, any of you three can take it, but it was addressed towards Alina, if one of you want to go first.
Can you repeat that? So sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So, oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. It wasn't addressed towards you, Alina. It was addressed towards Alba. But again, any of you can answer it. Alba, thinking a lot about how we speak to each other, even when we share a language during the pandemic, and that is in the mutual aid work convos, are often limited to how to fill an immediate emergency need. Thoughts about how we can build stronger connections of solidarity and away from charity approach.
Yeah, that's being an immigrant myself, a first generation immigrant, and being an activist. When we come to organize, when we come to be an agent in the community of change, those are very good questions to ask ourselves and reflect on, because we want to build a community where I see you as an equal. That's to me is social justice. Justice is like we are here and an equal partner, and the system that is that exists there to oppress vulnerable community, you know, is the common enemy. You know what I like? We don't want to perpetuate the language of oh, let me help you, or you know, because you need my help. It's more like how we can strengthen ourselves, how we could allocate resources that strengthen the vulnerable community in a way that is empowering, in a way that is not paternalistic, in a way that is not perpetuating the it's not perpetuating the way the oppressor, you know, the way of the oppressor. So when we are mindful of who is the person with the privilege, who is the person that is there in the community, that is want to be an agent of change and want to support other community, but at the same time is being in this position of like, I'm part of that of the system of that perpetuated oppression. So being mindful that when you tell people, okay, you I'll give you the resources, and I'm gonna be a partner in solidarity with you, without being paternalistic and without patronizing. And when I was an activist, I would, yeah, I would get really upset when I would see that the stage was taken by, and since and we were just repeating the same power dynamic of the person with the knowledge, this person with the authorities, the one on top telling the others what to do, how to live their lives. And I think breaking down those kind of way of doing things, and the way of breaking down the way of approaching how we communicate with language, and language is such a powerful tool. Language could build or destroy. So we're coming from the mentality of building and being in solidarity, and being in the position, this is being honest of what you role, what is your role in the social justice context. Like, what is my role, what's the role that I'm playing, and how am I impacting the movement, and how am I impacting the work that's being done collectively. And it's a day-to-day, it's a constant, it's constantly reminding yourself, what is my role, what is my position, am I perpetuating the same thing, am I contributing to those power dynamic. And just one thing that we always forget to do, just ask the other person, ask the person that you collectively being working with, how do you want this to be done, how do you want this, how do you want your how you want your community to be supported. And again, I try to move from the word helped, because to me it's such a paternalistic word. So how can we support your community without perpetuating all of this power dynamic? So that's my take on that.
Thank you, Alba. I just want to note that we're close to time, and this feels like a really important question. So I am going to give Alina and Amna the chance, 1 minute each. I know that's not a lot, if they want to take a stab at this question, and then we're going to transition to a wrap up and then announcements. So Alina, go for it.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think that mutual aid and mutual aid networks needs to keep going even after if we do this ill-advised reopening, because I think mutual aid is, and I'm definitely paraphrasing things that I've heard other scholars say, but mutual aid is building new relationships in our communities that help us envision an anti-capitalist future, and I hope that they do not turn into new nonprofits. Not too much shade on the nonprofits, but like I think. Like Alba was saying, if it turns into another service kind of relationship, then maybe we've lost an opportunity here. And I also want to say that these relationships will be critical moving forward into potentially a recession or a depression. Relationships that are built off survival and also the health of a community over making profit from them or from housing. So like for example, and I'll end on an example. One of the tenants that I work with, called Mr. Zhu, is scared because he doesn't speak English. He lives in public housing, and he says to me, he's scared because he doesn't know how to ask his neighbors for help if something happens around violence, because of what the president has been saying about COVID and East Asian immigrants. And so I think like building on those new relationships will be extremely important in terms of our imagination for what's possible outside of very like cutthroat profit over people system that I think will be coming for us as we move into austerity. So I'm there.
Thank you, Alina. And Amna, we'll give you 1 minute on your thoughts about the question of moving beyond charity.
Yeah, I will say this. We have a history of communities such as the Black Panthers having to step up to take care of themselves because the government hasn't or won't. Something that we don't have as much experience with because we're figuring it out on the fly. And for Drum, like organizing for people power has always been our priority and less around services, but in a pandemic, doing services is not an option. And so right now, like nonprofits and volunteers in the community are having to do what is the role of our government, providing food, cash assistance, but that can't be sustained for a very long time. And the CDC said chances in the fall the virus is coming back more strong and more deadly. And so there's this concept of when this is over, but for who? Given that we're about to reach like a moment of food scarcity, because we haven't taken care of our most vulnerable, the workers that ship farm all your food, who aren't provided with adequate safety measures, they're getting sick. People are going to be left with the consequences, with the recession, lost family members or loved ones, and people who have lost their jobs have no guarantee that they'll return to their jobs. Many mom and pop shops will go out of business. So where are we going to get the money for this or that? You know, where did we get the trillions of dollars to bail out companies? And so we really need these things in place so that volunteers trying to help people don't have to risk their lives. But for the time being, we're still doing that work of building out mutual aid we are still doing that work of building out mutual aid and connections, because the reality is we don't know until we do things differently now. And that looks like agitating people as we're seeing how this pandemic has exposed those systemic inequities. But are we organizing digitally? Are we thinking about Rent Strike or about providing assistance to essential workers excluded from those stimulus checks, from federal assistance, or on the local and state level? But yeah, something to think about is if this is over when this is over, for who? The global neo-fascist leaders, economic recession, as mentioned, or this capital system. So there's a lot for us all to think about. But as Mariam Kaba also says, hope is a discipline.
Thank you so much, Amna. And I'm now going to pass it over to Lucas to just give us a summary of some of the core points we've heard. Go for it, Lucas.
Yeah, first, just to thank our speakers. This is not just about like technical support, it's about deeper principles. And I really appreciated that we started by kind of getting grounded in some of the principles of language justice with some of the best organizers in the city who are working within migrant communities and different multilingual spaces. So really encourage people to check out the resources that have been shared too if they want to go a little bit deeper. And understanding this is really about the right of all of our neighbors to access vital information and know about their rights. And that often means decentering English. This is one of the most diverse places in the world linguistically too, and we need to have our organizing and mutual aid work reflect that. Other things that people have said that I wanted to just tie a little bow around is that we also need to like do the work to understand the communities, especially those of us who maybe don't have the same long-term ties to a neighborhood, is recognizing what languages are spoken in the area, where are people clustered, maybe the flyers that you're creating, making sure that you're addressing that in different pockets of the community. And then obviously you need to recruit volunteers that speak different languages and promoting the leadership of folks who have ties to diverse constituencies within your area. And we also talked about the materials that we produce, whether it's online or print, those should be available in multiple languages. And not just around the kind of narrow issues around food assistance that some of the mutual aid groups are doing, but other things around organizing opportunities, Rent Strikes, et cetera. And then this is about deep community partnerships that the volunteers who are coming together, who might be flocking to some of these Facebook pages, aren't necessarily the end all be all or have the real knowledge of the other existing stakeholders in the neighborhood, other community-based organizations, faith groups, leaders that have deeper ties to communities other than English speakers. And this is going to take work. As our last speaker was just mentioning, this crisis this is not that we're just in the tail end and we're going to do our final batch of delivering food. This crisis is going to be with us for years to come. And like Drum is doing, producing, and the Kensington Mutual Aid Group, producing materials in many different languages is often what is needed for this to actually make sure we're not excluding people, often the ones who are the most vulnerable. So I wanted to, again, thank everyone who spoke and who's on this call, and well, these are things that we need to share out to more people who aren't here as well, as we continue with what we're all doing.